Good afternoon. Hello.
Hello.
Sir,
You're logged in twice.
yes, sir. Is it fine now?
It's still echoing, I think. Let's try once more.
Hello.
Maybe it's fine, I think.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I request technical team to please mute themselves. Yes, sir. I request technical team to please keep themselves on mute. Hello. Am I audible, sir? Okay. I must be audible. Thank you, sir. So, good afternoon, everyone. It gives us immense pleasure and a sense of pride to welcome you all and your keen participation in this national webinar on fiscal policy and transmission, the case of India's state. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Nikhil Damodaran. He is currently an assistant professor at OP Jindal Global University. He is an applied economist by training and specialization in macroeconomic policy and its impact on trade and welfare. His work is largely located in analyzing countries in a currency union such as Eurozone or subnational regions in a country. We at Erodomics extremely grateful. We are extremely grateful to you, sir, for agreeing to take this webinar without any remunerative incentives and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us, sir. Paul Krugman, a new Keynesian economist, believes that a great thing about fiscal policy is that it has a direct impact and does not require you to bind the hands of future policymakers. Well, in a similar direction, today's webinar will shed some light on the transmission of fiscal efforts and the actual impacts observed, particularly in the case of Indian states. But before heading on to this intellectual refreshment, I request all the participants to mute themselves. Any query or doubt shall be posted in the chat box. All the queries will be taken up by the end of the session. So, without delaying any further, we request you, sir, to please begin the session. Over to you, sir.
Right. Thank you so much for having me here. It's online. I wish I could have actually been there and presented this and met my friend in Bhopal. It's been a long time. But without a lot of discussion on that and my grievances of online seminar, let's start the session. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to try to share my screen. Just a second, I'm having issues sharing my screen. Yes, I think now I should be able to share my screen. But I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen here in this. Your entire screen share. Yes. Okay, so that's fine. I'm going to keep this here. I'm going to. Can you see the slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So I'm going to just do full screen here. And I'm going to start now without further ado. So this paper is titled Fiscal Policy and Transmission, the Case of India States. My name is Nikhil again. Thanks for having me here. Bhopal School of Social Sciences is what I thought was the talk, but edudonomics is an interesting name. So I'll follow up on that later on. I'll just break down the title of the paper before telling you about how this is broadly interested in India's states. I'll break down the title in two aspects. One, a generic literature aspect of it, and how it's applicable to India's states and fiscal policies. So there are a few components in the paper which would be of interest and which naturally is the paper all about. So it's about fiscal policy. And the question that I'm trying to answer here is I'm trying to answer which fiscal policy should be used by states in India or in general, in a theoretical framework in general, for a member in a currency union. I'm not entirely accurate there in my description, and I'll talk more about that later on, especially for India states. The second component of my paper is India state. So it's not a fiscal policy applied to a generic setting. It's applied to a specific setting in which asks me or which urges me to answer questions which haven't been answered earlier in the literature before. There is some literature on the kind of work that I'm trying to do in the Eurozone, because Eurozone is the closest counterpart in terms of where the literature is going. But there hasn't been a question which is answered, which I am trying to sort of build up to and to see whether it makes sense or not. And I'll come to what the question is in some sense. In talking about India states, I am essentially talking about a region, or in abstraction, a region which has its own fiscal policy, but I'm specifically thinking about a region which does not have a monetary policy. So it's kind of like a country in a currency union, like countries in the Eurozone. But India states is slightly different from the Eurozone country, right? Because Eurozone countries can have income tax structure of their own, with India states do not have. So that restricts the question and the dimensions of fiscal policy which are examined in India states specific to India states vis-a-vis the Eurozone, though the structure of the model is pretty much similar. I'm also going to be focusing on the pre-GST era. So post-GST, these things matter less, and there are other things which come into picture, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'll flag issues which might be of interest post-GST era. Um, I'll think of specific types of policies for India states. I'm not thinking of transitory policies where if I change tax for a quarter or something, what happens? I'm going to think about changes in fiscal policies which are long lived. For instance, if Madhya Pradesh increases government spending on development purposes, how does that affect Madhya Pradesh? How does that affect Madhya Pradesh's neighboring states? Which comes to my third question and the third point of the title, that's transmission, which is exactly locating fiscal policy of a state like Madhya Pradesh, trying to understand what policy should Madhya Pradesh adopt and how that affects Madhya Pradesh's GDP and GDP of its trading partners. So I'm going to talk about this in general sense. I'll give you a couple of general insights into this question, which are newer in terms of the literature. And I'm going to talk specifically about states in India where these insights are applicable much, much more. So I'm going to talk about transmission, but transmission of a very particular type. I'm going to talk about trade transmission. I'm not going to talk about financial transmission and so on. There are labor migration issues along the states and so on. So I cannot talk about all of that. I'm not going to try and even attempt to understand that. I'm just going to talk about trade transmission between states in India. So essentially, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, hey, there's a state in India. It has its own fiscal policy in the pre-GST era. It does trade with its neighboring states, and in fact, all around the world in India, because India is essentially a fiscal union, right? But that brings me to this question of why am I talking about this now in 2021? I should have talked about this in 2017, but at that point of time, I did not have access to this data set. But 2017, and this is almost when GST was being implemented, the states did a survey of how much are regions within India trading among each other. So they wanted to know how much is, say, a state in India trading with its trading partners and, say, remote states from which it's very far off. Say, what's the impact of Jammu and Kashmir on Madhya Pradesh's GDP and so on. So there's this new data which came up in Economic Survey of 2017. And I'm going to use that data and I'm going to say, assume that Madhya Pradesh is a country, is a mini country of its own. It has its GDP and it trades with other states, which can be considered mini countries. And they are states with trade with each other. So it's an open economy. It's not just a country, it's an open economy. So I'm going to talk about fiscal policy of these states, which act as if they're open economies and highly integrated. The highly integrated part of it is because of these insights, which come from the Economic Survey of 2017. Remember, it's still dated, it's 5 years old, but we never had an idea of the severity of trade linkages within the Indian subcontinent. We just knew that, okay, there are Indian states which trade with each other. How important was this trade was not really known. So this is the first time that it was known. And I'm trying to use this fact to understand whether this fact hinders in selection of fiscal policy? Does it change insights from the literature, or does it give us new insights which are specific to Indian states? As I mentioned, I'm going to talk about the long run, permanent change in fiscal policy. I'm not going to talk about the dynamics, which in some sense is a more transitory behavior. So I'm going to talk about long run estimates and so on. The transitory status of fiscal policy is interesting. What I mean by transitory is, if I increase spending right now, how does the economy adjust? That's transition. So I'm not going to talk about the adjustment part of it. I'm just going to talk about where it eventually reaches. So I'm going to talk about that. Right. So that's essentially what the paper is. Now, where's my contribution here? My contribution, I see my contribution in these two different aspects. One is a larger aspect where I'm trying to push the fiscal policy literature again in open economies. Specifically, I'm going to talk about two theoretical results which have a proof and so on. These results are following these three papers by Farhi and Warning, and Corsetti and Presenti, which is a 2001 paper, where they're thinking of what fiscal policy should be optimal for economies which trade with each other, and what's the effect of this optimal fiscal policy on the trade relationship between these two countries. So I'm going to use that insight theoretically in the model that I'm going to show you. But I'm going to restrict myself to understanding whether a spending-led stimulus is still better in this context than a tax-led stimulus. The general consensus is that if you want to do a fiscal policy, and if you are a state in a currency union, or a country in a currency union, you should rely on government spending. You should rely on government spending no matter what. That's the consensus of the literature. There are cases, there is evidence that some tax reduction might be better than government spending. I'm just trying to test this in the Indian context. I'm trying to test this in terms of theory, the way that I've set up the model, and I'm going to test this in the Indian context. I'm going to also talk about how effective terms of trade, which is relative prices adjusted for these relative taxes, play on the budget of the government when fiscal policy is operated. What I mean by that in simple terms is, I'm going to say, hey, if the government changes its fiscal policy in a theoretical model, how does that affect relative prices? And because it affects relative prices, it also affects government's budget indirectly. Right? So I'm going to see how that theoretical line gets solved in the model. Empirically, I'm going to take these experiments in states in India, and I'm going to understand whether we can use these fiscal policy tools and the model that I've set up to think about the divergence of trajectories, state trajectories in India. Which means, what I'm trying to say here is that, is it possible that states which were underdeveloped to begin with never had a chance to catch up to the other states because their fiscal policies were so against them, whereas the states which were already developed had opportunity to even more, or develop even more than states which didn't? And that's the missing link, is fiscal policy, is what I'm trying to tell you here. I'm trying to say that states which were developed had resources to spend. They could spend and grow more. States which grew had tax revenue, so they could grow even more. And states which did not grow could not spend because of budgetary regulations, and did not have tax revenues also to further increase stimulus and so on. So these are empirical experiments specific to India, but they're coming out of the theory that I'm going to show you right now. But before we go on to empirical experiments, there's a natural way to think about such experiments in data, and just see, hey, we have data for about 30 years for Indian states, what their tax revenue is, what their government spending is, and to see whether we can use that data to understand which fiscal policy is better and why. Um, this follows a literature by Clarda and Camps and Chowdhury. The former is a literature which talks about identification of fiscal policy. They're basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, hey, if government spending increases, can I tell that the increase in output this year is because of government spending? Can I identify the effect of government spending on output? So they use identification techniques which are standard in literature. Plada and Camps specifically uses an SWAR identification with an instrument. So their novelty is that they use SWAR within the ambit of an instrumental variable to test that. But that sort of a hypothesis requires a lot more data, so that's not possible for the Indian context. Chaudhry, on the other hand, does a very interesting exercise. He says that let's not bother about data. Let's think of fiscal policy and its effect cross sectionally. And he says he might not have a long time series for India, and he does this for America, but I'm translating that version to India. He says we don't have a long time series for India. What if we can use the differences in spending between states in India, or across states in India to be specific, and try to find whether state A spends 100 rupees and state B spends 200 rupees? Is the state B growing more than state A? And how much more? Is it growing 100 rupees more, or is it growing more than 100 rupees more? That's what Chartreuse experiment is. So what I did is I ran Chaudhry's experiment. I said, hey, there's no harm in running that experiment, right? Chaudhry's model is given as follows. For those of you who are familiar with fixed effects regression, this is essentially a fixed effects regression, but with a specific component to it. What Chaudhry does is Chaudhry tries to have a time fixed effect. What that does is it throws out whatever time series variation is there in the data. So if government spending is increasing every year for a certain state, it throws that out. The trend of the increase in government spending is thrown out because of the time fixed effects, and what is left is cross-sectional variation. Now, using this cross-sectional variation, he tries to see, and this FST is the cross-sectional variation in fiscal policy. He's trying to understand the effect of this fiscal policy on YS. YS is here the GDP, or GSDP to be specific for that state. Alpha HT is the time fixed effects. So essentially that's demeaning the data across time, so that we are only left with cross-sectional component. We are interested in the beta, which is here, which is shown here. What this beta shows is the beta tells us if I increase government spending by 100 rupee, how much will GDP increase by? If the beta says it's more than 1, then an increase in 100 rupee leads to more than 100 rupee increase in GDP. To tell you what we expect here, the literature expects government spending to be approximately around 1. The tax numbers aren't comparable because the tax literature sort of has an argument. There's a huge range for taxes. If you reduce tax rates, you expect income, GDP, to increase because you're giving tax incentives to people. That number varies from anywhere between 0.5 to 4. So there's not a lot of consensus on the tax front here. I'm trying to think about a generic fiscal policy, and I'm trying to handle both tax and spending here. X are a bunch of controls which are cross-sectional controls and not time series controls. Remember, if I've thrown out everything which is there in which is varying across time, I'm left with cross-sectional variation. Now, for cross-sectional variation and identification of beta, which means if I have to get the correct estimate of fiscal policy on GDP, I have to control for cross-sectional variations across states. Some states have more schools. Some states have more hospitals, literate population, and so on. Right? These are controls. These are a bunch of controls which are here in X's. All this data is taken from RBI's Handbook for Indian States, so it's readily available. You just have to clean it a bit, but essentially that's the regression here. Now I want you to focus on the regression, but just in passing, assuming that I've done a reasonable job in doing the regression themselves. What I want you to notice here is model 2 and model 10. So there are a bunch of other models which I've ran. I've reported the models which are interpretable. Right? All these models are interpretable. The standard errors are all fine. So I've not reported the standard errors, but there are stars there. So if you look at the spending multiplier, this is the beta number. So the beta number for spending is 0.84. What it says is that my spending multiplier is almost close to 1. If you look at 10, the tax multiplier is surprisingly more than the spending multiplier, right? 1.06. So what happens and so on, we are not really sure whether the correct fiscal policy for a state should be spending or tax. By just looking at models 2 and 10, I'm thinking, hey, if I want to do the correct fiscal policy, I should reduce tax if I am a state and allow for my GDP to increase and potentially reduce taxes which I can as a state. And that's what this says. But these models aren't identified or aren't identifying the beta accurately. If you put in a bunch of controls there, and if you do a couple of specification corrections, you come to models 3 and models 11. So if you look at 3 and 11, 0.53 and 0.68, taxes are still stronger than spending. So what this says is that the reduced form effect of taxes is still more than the reduced form effect of spending, which goes against the conventional consensus of literature. So Chartreuse experiments were right up till model 7. Chartreuse did not compare this model for tax as a fiscal policy instrument. So when you put tax, then Chartreuse identification becomes murky. So you're wondering, hey, what's happening here? Can I make some conclusive results from this? Which fiscal policy is better if I were a state in India? What should I do? Should I reduce taxes to increase my GDP? Or should I increase my spending? Right? Those are the two policies that I'm thinking about broadly. And where is trade in all this? That's where my problem is here. Now, the results are coming because they misidentify cross correlations between error terms and the GDPs themselves. The barring the technicality of the slide, what it means is that I'm not able to identify or correct for the fact that my GDP for, say, Tamil Nadu is explained partially by GDP in Kerala, which means if the Kerala government ends up spending money, part of that increase in spending increases its own GDP, but it also increases Tamil Nadu's GDP because there are spillover effects through trade. People in Kerala start importing goods from Tamil Nadu. That helps boost Tamil Nadu's GDP. That effect is not caught by the regression which I showed you just now. And this is why Chartreuse framework might be fine in identifying spending multipliers, But if you look at spending and tax multipliers side by side, the framework breaks down. And this is my conjecture for this. It's still a conjecture, so that's why I need to solve that problem. How do I solve this problem? How do I know which policy should I rely on if I were a state in India and I want to increase my GDP? Uh, I, being aware of the fact that I want to do a fiscal stimulus, I trade with other states, so which means I have to control for the fact that, hey, if I put some stimulus there, it might likely affect my trading partner too. And what do I do? There are a couple of solutions to this. One is an econometric solution for which you need, again, a lot more data, which sadly for India we don't have, to estimate a system's GMM, where you take care of these cross sectional spillovers in the sense that GDP of Kerala affects GDP of Tamil Nadu. You can actually, if you have enough data, you can actually take care of this, and there are econometric models established to do that. Another way would be to set up a macroeconomic model. Since we don't have a lot of data, we just use one time point, and set up the model to mimic Indian states for that particular time point, and then let the model do the job. Right? So I'm going to do the latter. I'm going to set up a New Keynesian New Keynesian DSGE model. I'm going to not talk about the stochastic and the dynamic part of it, because I'm going to think about more of an RBC model, but with a couple of imperfections. What kind of imperfections am I talking about? I'm talking about the standard Calvo imperfections, but I'm also talking about imperfections because of distortionary taxes. So, which means I'm going to add to the existing New Keynesian literature richness of fiscal policy, and in an environment in which the model is as if it's a currency union model. I'll come to clarifications there, but okay, let me just give you the clarification before going into the model per se. So there's one thing that I'm going to show you. The model treats one state. It thinks about the consumer and the producer of that state, and then it thinks about the government of that state, and then it says if consumers and producers act optimally and the government ends up increasing spending, how is that going to affect the state's GDP, and how is that going to affect its partners' GDP through trade, right? The caveat here is that I'm assuming that the central government doesn't come into this picture. So I'm not modeling the central government, which gives tax revenue, which disburses tax revenues based on an arrangement, a revenue sharing arrangement, which they had before GST, right? So this is the VAT times that I'm talking about. So that's the caveat. I'm modeling this transaction as a currency union and not as a fiscal union, which I should have done had I taken care of the central government spending. This is the standard model. So without stopping by, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you the gist of this model and not bore you with a lot of details. And I tell you where you should focus on, how that affects the results. I'm going to spend more time explaining what's happening, what's the result of this model, and not proving some theorem and results and so on. So the standard New Keynesian model, for those of you who are not used to this literature, is a model where there are consumers who consume, that's their behavior, producers who produce. The interaction between the consumer and the producer is in the goods market. Consumer is buying the commodity and producer is selling the commodity. And there's this third agent which says, hey, I'm going to tax producer, I'm going to tax consumer. And the government is just taxing producers and consumers. That's all that it does. And it consumes. Government consumption can be thought of as expenditure, development expenditure, and so on. So let producers and consumers act as if they're acting on their own incentive, and the government, all it does is puts taxes on them, and does its own spending. That's what it does in this model. And I'll tell you how it becomes open economy in a minute. So consumer is deriving utility. So there are a continuum of consumers. We'll think of consumers as partly located in the home country and the others located in the foreign countries. There'll be two countries. You can think of this as one state and all the other states together, right? So you're thinking of which state you are in. Madhya Pradesh is the home country, and the other are the other states here. And I'll tell you where this matters and so on. The utility function is pretty standard here. It says that consumer gets utility from consumption. Consumer does not like working, so he gets disutility from labor. Consumer gets some utility from the public provision of public goods and so on. So if there are street lights and roads, that appear here in the utility function. There are habits in consumption, which means if you were consuming something, say if you were consuming 5,000 rupees per month on your day-to-day groceries and so on, you would like to maintain that. So you don't like going below 5,000 rupees. Or in real terms, you would not like to buy one less Maggie packet because you're used to buying one Maggie packet. So you want to continue buying that Maggie packet, right? This utility function is optimized based on a period by period budget constraint, which says this is the consumption, which is given a subsidy. So government says, hey, you take this money and you subsidize the consumption because I'm going to put taxes on you for the income that you earn, wage income that you earn. I'm going to put taxes on you for the profit that you earn for the firms that you have shares of. And I'm going to put taxes on you, which are lump sum taxes. And the consumer is smart. Consumer wants to save if he wants to be optimal across the lifetime. He saves in two ways. One, he buys these bonds which are floated by the government. So government floats treasury bills. He can float treasury bills. And he can buy a security which is traded internationally, which in this case is traded in the union. So this is like buying a bond from the central government, and this is like buying a bond from the state government. So you can have two types of bonds here. There is particular usage for that, and I'll come to where this is. The earlier slide did not tell you anything about trade. This slide tells you about trade. What this slide tells you is that the aggregate consumption is actually an aggregation. It's basically added up of domestic consumption and imports. So this opens up the model as a trade model. Had I not had this slide, I would have had a closed economy model and I would have done closed economy stuff to it. But this is an open economy model. In addition to that, and this is a pretty standard aggregation function, the omegas are import propensities, or this is the proportion that I consume domestically. So this is the proportion that I import. So the remaining is what I consume domestically. The epsilon L's are trade elasticities. So they are like responsiveness to relative prices and how I choose between what I consume at home and what I consume from the next neighboring state. In addition to this domestic consumption and import bit, there are these variety of firms which are there in my state. So I don't have just one firm in my state. I have like many firms which have their own quality. So I'm going to buy an optimal amount from each of these firms. That's what I'm going to do here. You add all that up, what it essentially boils down to is this Backus-Smith condition. There's a paper by Backus-Smith where they say that consumption, if I consume in this manner, then my consumption is linked with my trading partner's consumption through a risk-sharing condition, which is given as follows. This assumes a bunch of things which makes our life simple in terms of running the model. But essentially what it says is this. It says that GDP of one state is jointly determined by GDP of the other state, which means you cannot tell what the GDP of Kerala would be without knowing the GDP of Tamil Nadu, because Kerala trades with Tamil Nadu. So if somebody has to give me a number of GDP for Kerala, that has to be conditional on how much it trades with Tamil Nadu. That's essentially what this states. In the larger context, what it does is it basically links these two economies together. That's what it's doing. So that's the consumer side of it. In the consumer side of it, I haven't explained taxes because the taxes aren't going to be used a lot. They're just there for theoretical purposes. In the producer side, now I have some taxes which are important. The essential component of consumer side is the story that the GDP of the two economies are linked together. In producer's side, the story is this. Producer is a profit maximizing producer, has optimal profits, but two things are of interest. One, the producer has to pay a VAT in the home state. So if I'm a producer, I'm selling in my state, I have to pay a VAT. But if I'm selling in my neighboring state, I don't have to pay a VAT in my state. I have to pay a VAT in the neighbor's state. That VAT is denoted by this tau VT star. So remember, VAT is a destination tax. Wherever I sell, I pay VAT there. The second thing that I want you to remember is this bit. This is called excise duty. So as soon as a commodity gets produced in the factory, you have to pay excise duty for that. In fact, as soon as it leaves the factory, you have to pay excise duty for that. This was there before. This is still there. Post GST regime, it's still there. And we can talk about where it is. So these two taxes affect producers' decision of optimal profits. Like he's thinking, okay, if there's less tax in Tamil Nadu, maybe I might just sell my commodities in Tamil Nadu. I'm taking Tamil Nadu and Kerala because I'm from Kerala, so that's familiar to me, right? This profit function has to be maximized, but the constraint here is the demand function, right? So producers produce based on what demand is available. In this case, there's a domestic demand component to it, and there's an international demand component to it. By international, I mean the rest of the states. They also consume my commodity, but my consumers also consume my commodity. It becomes new Keynesian by this particular slide. For these producers to be monopolistically competitive, they have to be able to set their own prices. So in order to set their own prices, what they essentially do is they choose their prices every period with their probability of 1 minus she, or if they can't set their prices that period, they just index their price to what was their last period. Right? This is standard Calvo mechanism. What it does, it makes inflation sticky, or it does not allow for rapid price movements. Like in a classical model, what happens is if there are changes in production, prices change quickly and you have an equilibrium reached. Here, it takes a bit of a time. That's what New Keynesian model is essentially. In addition to that, the open economy bit here is that there producer currency pricing, which essentially means that I'm going to sell the commodity in the same price. So I'm not going to sell this commodity for 2 rupees in Kerala and for 5 rupees in Tamil Nadu. I'm going to assume that no transportation cost and so on and so forth. I'm going to sell the same commodity at 2 rupees and 2 rupees in both the states. This gives me all of this optimal reaction, gives me the New Keynesian Phillips curve, which is standard to the New Keynesian literature. Basically, for the producer, what we're interested in, how the producer is responding to these taxes. Finally, we come to the government. I'm not showing you the optimal response functions and so on. The government, as I said, the government does nothing. The government consumes this GT, and government has a budget constraint. The budget constraint is the VAT that it levied and the excise duty that it levied. So it levied VAT and it levied excise duty. It floated bonds. So it floated bond for which it could finance itself, but it had to also spend on domestic and foreign goods. Now remember, government also ends up importing some of its commodities. So state government of Kerala does import something from Madhya Pradesh, but it also consumes something locally. So the part it imports from Madhya Pradesh is this. The part it consumes locally is this. This is very symmetric to consumer. My argument is, why should governments be different optimally than consumers, right? A government should also be optimal. So that's the idea here. Now, the central bank, this is standard. This is just to close the model. It's in some sense a dummy equation here, but it works. And this is the reaction function of RBI. Now, the interesting thing here is that RBI does not bother if one country's GDP increases or the other country's state's GDP decreases. So it does not really bother about this. What it bothers about is the aggregate GDP. If the aggregate India's GDP is close to its potential output, then it does not change its monetary policy. So if there are these reallocations among state, RBI is silent on that, which is where the more interesting bit of this paper is essentially. So the last bit that I'm going to talk about is that I'm going to say that there are no FRBM rules here. So fiscal policy is not constrained in any sense. You can potentially constrain them, but let's just see what's optimal. Then we can talk about constraints. Okay, this is so we've talked about consumers, we've talked about producers, we've talked about government. This is the trade bit here. What it says is that this ST is relative prices. PHT star is the price at which home producer exports. So this is my exporting price divided by the price at which I'm importing. PFT, and you won't get this notation again, so I'm skipping over it. PFT is the price at which I'm importing from my neighboring state, right? The essence of this model is potentially in this equation. This equation says my domestic consumption is somehow affected by relative prices and relative taxes. That's all that it says. It says that effective terms of trade determine how much I'm going to consume from my state versus how much am I going to import from the other state. The logic is that consumer does not really bother about consuming locally. Consumer bothers about consuming cheap. So whichever is cheaper, if the cheaper commodity is produced in his or her home state, he consumes that. If it doesn't, he imports from the neighboring state. That's essentially what it says. And this brings in aspects of income effect and substitution effect, which I'll talk soon. Now, this slide is essentially saying that all the data that I have chosen a couple of years. Well, I've chosen one specific year, and I've said, okay, let me make this model into an Indian model or a model suited for Indian states where the trade elasticities are observed by the trade data that I remember told you that this is a new data. So these trade elasticities are coming from that data. The 1.10 is coming from that data. The import shares are coming from that trade data. The VAT, state, and Sen excise, Sen VAT is coming from the budget for the state governments. All the other parameters are pretty standard for most countries and most aggregate data. This is also true for Indian data. The other side is that for India, prices are slightly less sticky. So this is 0.75, which means prices fluctuate more for India. So that parameter is slightly different. But anyways, this slide tells me that now I've made a general model for transactions across countries in a currency union as a model for Indian states. Now with this model, what can I do? Remember, this is pre-GST. I'm going to not talk about the calibration. I'm going to talk about what I'm doing with this model. I'll just take 10 more minutes and then I'm open for questions. I'm doing a couple of experiments which talk about fiscal policy and one experiment which talks about trade. The couple of experiments which talk about fiscal policy are answering this question. If I am a state which has potential trade linkages with other states in India, and the monetary policy is not on my side, I don't have income taxes with me, I don't have a variety of taxes that I can potentially use. I just have VAT and I have excise duty. Those are the only two taxes. And I have government spending. Part of the money that I earn, maybe I can spend somewhere. I'm thinking of these three taxes that I potentially have, and you can look at the budgets of the state government. The broad categories are basically VAT and excise duty. They cover about 85% of state revenues. Even now, VAT is a significant, excise duty is a significant proportion of state revenues. I'll tell you why. That's a trick question. Post GT. And the third component that I have for a state is government spending. So I'm thinking, if I were a state and I want my GDP to increase, right? I want to catch up to the other states. What do I do? Should I focus on government spending, or should I focus on reducing these taxes so that I give incentive? What sort of taxes do I have in control? Well, I have VAT. VAT is levied to producer, but it spreads around its base. But there's the other tax, which is excise duty. The excise duty is specific to producers. I'm going to think, okay, which of these policies should I use? If I have to use taxes, I have to reduce taxes. If I have to use spending, I have to increase the spending. The way to think about these experiments is government spending shifts the demand curve to the right, right? An aggregate demand shift to the right, whereas tax reduction shifts the aggregate demand to the right conventionally, but you can think of this as shifting aggregate supply to the right instead. Why? Because these taxes are levied on the consumers. So what I'm essentially comparing is, should I shift my aggregate demand to the right by increasing government spending? Or should I incentivize producer to shift their aggregate supply to the right so that they are supplying more and the prices come down and there's more welfare in the economy? That's what I'm thinking. The second question that I'm thinking is, how do I finance it? If I have to finance this expenditure, if I have to increase government spending, where do I finance it from? If I have to reduce taxes, some of these taxes, how do I do it? Right? And the third question that I'm asking is related to trade, to which I think I'll come to next when I discuss that question. Let's talk about the first question. The three types of policies that the states do have them in their mind. Let's see what happens when they use these three fiscal policies on output. If I increase my government spending and I finance it through a lump sum tax, forget about what that means, but if I finance it through lump sum tax, what I observe is that in this model, which is suited to India, which has these trade linkages, my output increases by 0.56, which is slightly on the lower side, but it's still an acceptable number in terms of government spending multipliers. These are cross-sectional long-run multipliers, which means if you increase government spending by 1 rupee, your output increase is going to be by an additional 0.56 rupee, right? 1.56 is what the effect is going to be. This is taking into account the fact that I have crowded out some consumption. Remember, if you're conventional macro crowding out, that's investment. But consumption in some sense works in a similar manner to investment because it's related to the rate of interest. So that's what consumption multiplier is. But anyways, there's a reduction of consumption. So if you remember your y equals c plus I plus g, g increases, c decreases. And that's the effect that I'm thinking about and the output multiplier that I'm talking about. If you compare that, and I'm just looking at the domestic transmission bit here, I will come to the trade transmission in a bit. If you compare that with a reduction in VAT does not increase my output by that much. Why is that so? Because VAT gets spread out, and the main reason is that VAT does not create employment benefits. What happens essentially is that if I reduce VAT, firms end up taking more profit and do not end up shifting the aggregate supply curve to the right. They do not produce more. On the other hand, if I were to reduce my excise duty, firms end up producing more, well, at least more than what they were producing in VAT, but less than government spending. So even an excise duty reduction is not enough to incentivize output and production. A reduction in excise duty has significant employment benefits. In fact, if you look at the last column here, this is essentially what Himachal is doing. Himachal is reducing its excise duty. So a lot of factories are going and settling into Himachal. And that's how their fiscal policy is structured. They give incentives. They hope for employment effects, which is what the model shows. But what my claim here is that even if there are these significant trade linkages, or there are these spillovers, the best policy still is government spending. Which brings me to why that spillover is important here. Now, when your standard open economy macro says that if you increase government spending, you increase domestic prices. If you increase domestic prices, you look at composition changes here. Terms of trade worsens, which means what's happening here is when you're increasing government spending, you're creating domestic inflation in your economy and you worsen your exports. Your exports become more expensive here. Remember, there's no exchange rate in this model because it's a currency union in which there's no exchange rate. So you're relying on terms of trade effect. So what's happening is that government pushes aggregate demand to the right, prices increase, and these prices end up increasing the price of its exports, which implies that now consumer is thinking, why should I buy commodities produced in my home? I will import it from the other state, which implies that my exports worsen and my imports improve. That's essentially what this is. So, why am I suspicious of government spending in an open economy, especially with the kind of linkages which are there in India? Is because of that. That it is quite possible that an increase in government spending could actually benefit my trading partner, which is what happens. If you look at 2A, an increase in government spending in the home economy actually increases the foreign GDP by 14, well, 0.14%. That's the positive spillover to the trading partner. And that spillover comes from worsening of terms of trade. Now, VAT is always going to be the middle one. That's why it's in the middle. If you look at the reduction in excise duty, this does not have the effect of a terms of trade worsening. What an excise duty does is it says to the producers in your home state that let me put less tax on you. You produce goods, sell them at a cheaper price, and attract demand from outside state too. So that's why Himachal is able to export a lot of commodities, apples including, and Himachal apples are bought in Delhi, especially because of things like excise and so on. Well, the case of apples is actually very different, but excise is being thought of as a factory commodity in some sense. So my bottom line here in this slide is that despite leakages for government spending, and despite the fact that an excise reduction is beneficial for trade with the other states, government spending is still better than any reduction of taxes, even if the trade intensity is so much. Right? Okay. Now, I'm just going to skip over this because I've sort of switched up on time. But anyways, the sense of the next experiment is now I'm thinking, okay, there are these three fiscal policies, but it isn't realistic to think about these three fiscal policies in isolation. There's a budget constraint for the government. What if the state government is forced to increase its spending through increasing its own taxes? So the bottom line of this slide is that government spending is still better than excise duty. But notice that in this case, what I'm doing is I'm saying that let's increase government spending by increasing VAT. So VAT is financing the government spending. The government is not financing this by deficit financing or anything else. Even a reduction in excise duty is being financed by increase in VAT. But despite constraining myself in terms of fiscal policy, I still feel, and the model says so, that government spending is still the more effective way to generate a stimulus. And you cannot push aggregate supply curve right enough with even an excise duty reduction, particularly when you're forced to generate resources endogenously. This is in fact standard to the literature, and the magnitudes are somewhat surprising because they are on the lower side of it, and that's peculiar to the way India's tax structure is, I feel. Now I come to the last experiment, which is to think, which I've been talking about open economy and so on, right? That there are these strong trade linkages. What if I'm not really bothered about uh, doing a lot more on the domestic economy, but I'm just bothered about using fiscal policy in a manner that I can actually capture demand of my trading partner. So in some sense, what I'm trying to think here is, what if Himachal Pradesh can lower excise duty so much so that it can cause its relative prices to be so low that it captures demand for Punjab and so on. What if that happens? Now, this is an experiment very similar to Farhi's 2014 paper, Review of Economic Statistics. It's an amazing paper there. Their idea was that, hey, these countries don't have exchange rate, right? The typical way to do this would have been to devalue in an open economy, but that's not available for countries like states in India, which do not have exchange rate at their disposal, but are still open economies with significant trade linkages. They can use their fiscal policies to lower their relative prices and have an effective devaluation. This devaluation they call fiscal devaluation because it's causing a devaluation using fiscal policy. So now what I'm trying to think about here is, what if states in India had their own exchange rate, right? Maybe just plug in an exchange rate at a random point and ask it to devalue, and then compare if I can generate a trade, uh, well, current account improvement using fiscal devaluation. So, what this slide in the nutshell shows is that if states in India had exchange rate, they would have used devaluation, but it would have led to the foreign country being much more worse off and largely causing retaliatory effects. On the other hand, if states in India use fiscal policies to tinker the relative prices here, that would lead to an increase in, improvement in trade balance. That's what you're using devaluation for, to improve your trade balance. Not really using devaluation to increase your GDP, just using devaluation to capture the foreign market. So you can use fiscal policy also to capture the foreign market, just like Himachal Pradesh would have potentially done. And it is a valid mechanism to use fiscal policies. So what I've done here is I've used fiscal policies to answer two questions for states in India. Which policy is the best? Short answer is government spending, and the reasons are there. Taxes don't work, and which policy is best for controlling current account deficit if the states had one, right? And for that, again, I'm saying that, okay, there's potential room for use of taxes there. Spending will not work. And that's the reason for using, excise duty instead of government spending. So if a state is using excise duty, it's potentially trying to correct its current account imbalance with other states in India. But if it's using government spending, it's trying to just push up its GDP. So that's how GDP for fiscal policy for India should be structured optimally. And this is still a nascent work. There is a lot more to be discussed here, and this paper is still shaping up. Dynamics and all that is still being continued. But to summarize it all, Relative prices matter as much as direct demand stimulus, and that depends on what you're trying to do with the fiscal policy, whether you're trying to generate a stimulus or you're trying to correct imbalances across states. Um, that's it for my presentation. I hope I did not shoot a lot ahead of time. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll see if anybody has any questions. Do you want me to keep my screen there, or do you want me to? Yes. Maybe I'll just keep my slides up. Yes. In case anybody has any questions. I've skipped over a bunch of things, but if you have any questions on any part of the presentation, you're welcome.
Participants are requested to pose the questions if they have any.
Right. All ears for any questions. And any doubts, clarification, welcome.
Okay, no questions. Then we'll move on towards the end of the session, sir. That was indeed a very informative and thought provoking session. We would like to thank you, sir, for giving our minds the required appetizer for our further quest into the subject. We would like to thank our principal, Father Dr. John PJ, and our head of the department, Dr. Paminder Kaur, for their never ending support. We would also thank all the participants for making this event a success, and we hope all of the participants had a great learning session today. Once again, thank you so much, sir, for your effort and time. Dear
Right. Thank you
participants,
so much. Yeah.
thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
There's a note for participants. The feedback link has been posted in the chat box, which will be active for the next 15 minutes. Kindly fill the feedback form before time. Once again, thank you so much, sir, for your
Right.
time.
Thank you so much for having me here. I hope it was more interesting than online seminars usually.
Yes, sir.
And it was relatable for states in India, and you had some thought there.
Yes, sir.
Right.
We are grateful, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you so much. Right.
All those who have filled the form can exit the meeting, and the time is next 15 minutes. Kindly fill the feedback form before time.